The tax card the county clerk slid across the counter valued the lot at nothing. Not a low number. Nothing. 50 miles of standing timber flume on 90-foot trestle legs, a headwork shack, and a mile of Red Rock Canyon wall it clung to like a snake gone stiff in the sun, and the assessor had written a single flat line where the value should have been. And beside it, the words, "Unfit for salvage, hazard to livestock." It was the one lot at the whole spring auction that no rancher, no mine agent, and no speculator in a good coat would put a coin on. And Prudence Vane, 26 years old, widowed inside the year, turned out of her father's house with $4 and his draw knife wrapped in an oilcloth. Bought it because it was the only thing left in the world that had ever belonged to a man who had loved her. But what nobody standing in that dusty land office knew, not the agent who laughed, not the banker counting her coins, not Prudence herself, was that behind one iron door her father had kept padlocked her whole childhood and never once explained. There was a thing sealed in the dark that would turn a rotting flume no one would touch into the most valuable ground in the entire valley. Before this story is over, that door will open. Settle in and let us know down in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, as we tell the story of the widow, the dead flume, and the water that came home. She had been Prudence Ashby before she was Prudence Vane, and before either she had simply been Prue, the tall child with the auburn hair her mother could never keep braided, who walked the survey line at her father's heel while he talked to the canyon as though it could answer. Elias Ashby had built the great V-flume as other men build cathedrals, patient and half in love with it. And for the better part of 2 decades, the timber of the high country had ridden his wooden trough down the sheer wall of the canyon to the mill at the valley floor, 50 miles of cut lumber floating on a hand's depth of water. She had grown up to the far, steady rush of it as a coastal child grows up to surf. And then the timber company that owned the mill and paid his wages folded in a single bad season. The standing forest went to a syndicate that meant to strip it and move on. And the men who had raised the trestles went east on the same train that carried away the accounts. Her father had stayed. He had kept the flume long after there was any reason to, drawing his grade books by lamplight. And every single night of her girlhood he had climbed to the headworks above the shack and lit a squat brass lantern in the window frame there, and when she asked him why, he only ever said the same soft thing, that he lit it so the water could find its way home. She had thought it a nothing phrase, the kind of gentle foolishness a tired man says to a child. She had not understood it. She would not understand it for a long time yet. Elias had died in the winter, quietly, of a chest that had rattled for years, and the debts he left were the ordinary debts of an honest man who had been paid in promises. The house went first. Silas Croft, who owned the bank in the valley town of Kestrel, and a good deal of everything the bank did not, handled the matter himself. And he did it the way a man cleans a wound, without any particular cruelty and without any particular mercy. He sat behind a desk the color of dried blood and read her the figures in a level voice, and when he was finished, he pushed 4 silver dollars across the wood toward her and folded his hands. "That is the settlement, Mrs. Vane," he said. "After the notes and the burying costs, that is what remains to you. The house passes to the bank at the end of the month. I would counsel you to take work in town. A young widow can always find a place in a kitchen." Prudence looked at the 4 coins and did not touch them. "And my father's flume?" Croft's mouth did something that on a warmer man would have been a smile. The Flume is not an asset, Mrs. Vane. It is a liability the county would very much like to be rid of. It will come up at auction with the other unpaid lots. I would not trouble yourself over it. No sane man will bid. He squared the papers. Your father was a fine engineer and a poor businessman. It is not a rare combination out here. Good day. She took the $4, because a woman with nothing does not leave silver on a table for pride, and she walked out into the hard white light of a territory afternoon with everything she owned in a leather satchel slung across her body, a change of linen, her mother's comb, a heel of bread, and the draw knife in its oilcloth. She wore the faded cream dress with the small worn flowers that she had worn to bury both of them, her mother years back and now her father, and her hair she had put up in a braided bun, because grief, she had found, wants your hands busy. She had a husband once, too, briefly, a decent, quiet man named Tom Vane, who had gone under the wheels of an ore wagon on the Kestrel grade before their first anniversary, and so at 26 she was that thing the frontier made too often and pitied too little. A young woman with no man and no roof and no name that meant money. She had the draw knife. She had $4. She had, though she did not yet call it that, the Flume. She spent the next 3 weeks in the loft over Bridget Halloran's boarding kitchen, earning her keep at the wash boiler, and it was in that steaming room that she first began to understand how thoroughly the valley had already decided who she was. Women came in with bundles of linen, and they were kind to her the way you are kind to a thing that is going to break, and men in the front room spoke of her father over their coffee as a cautionary tale. The clever fool who had built the biggest thing in the county and died owing money on it. Nobody was wicked about it. That was the part that sat hardest. It was worse than wickedness. This smooth agreement that Elias Ashby had been a dreamer, and his daughter was a dreamer's leavings, and the kindest thing the town could do was find her a quiet corner and let her disappear into it. She scrubbed the linen, and she said nothing, and she let them think it. And inside her something small and stubborn refused. The auction was held on the plank porch of the land office at the end of those 3 weeks, and the lots that had value went briskly. Grazing sections, a played-out claim, a town lot with a burned store on it. Men in good hats bid in flat voices. And then the agent, a florid man named Harmon Teague, who wore his prosperity like a second waistcoat, came to the last lot. And he did not so much read it as perform it. Lot the last, gentleman, Teague announced, and he let his gaze travel the porch to be sure the joke would land. The Ashby Flume. 50 miles of rotten trough on stilts, 1 shack, and all the canyon nobody wants. Assessed value, I am obliged to tell you by law, he paused nothing. Do I hear $1 for a wooden snake with no head? A few men laughed. Somebody said it ought to be blown up before a steer walked under it. Teague was already reaching to strike the lot from the book when Prudence stepped forward from the shade of the porch post where she had been standing. $4, she said. The porch went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when it decides to enjoy something. Teague looked at her, at the mended dress and the satchel, and his florid face arranged itself into a kind of delighted pity. $4, from Mrs. Vane. He spoke her name loud so the others would know it, know whose daughter this was. You understand you are bidding on a monument to bad planning. There is no water right in it, no timber contract, no earthly use. A man could not give it away. $4, she said again. It is what I have. Well, Teague spread his hands to the crowd, a showman handing them the finish. Sold then to the widow for the whole of her fortune. May it bring her every joy her father got out of it. And under the laughter he took her $4 silver off the plank rail and made a mark in the book. And Prudence Vane owned 50 miles of dead Flume and had not 1 cent left in the world. She did not laugh with them, and she did not weep. She put the paper deed in her satchel next to the draw knife, and she started walking up the canyon road toward the only thing that was hers. What she found, when she reached it, near dark, took the breath out of her, and not in any kind fashion. This is the part the disappointment lives in, the part the old stories all have the moment the thing you have staked everything on turns out smaller and more ruined than the child in you remembered. From the valley, the Flume had always been a marvel. A clean line ruled down the red wall by a confident hand. Up close, in the failing light, it was a corpse. The trestle bents that had once marched down the cliff straight as soldiers now leaned, some of them drunk on rotted footings. Whole runs of the V-boards had sprung and fallen and lay smashed in the talus below like the ribs of something enormous. Birds had nested in the launder. The headwork shack had lost half its shingles, and its door hung by one strap hinge, groaning, and the great sound she had grown up inside, the rush of moving water, was simply gone. The canyon held nothing now but wind and the tick of cooling stone. She stood a long while and let it be as bad as it was. Then she went into the shack, because the alternative was to sleep in the open. And she found a lamp with a finger of oil still in it and a striker in a tin, and she made a small light in the ruin of her father's life. There was his cot, the ticking gone to mice. There was his workbench with the tools rusted to the pegboard. There was a shelf of grade books furred with dust. And through the sprung boards of the far wall, framed like a picture, she could see across the black gulf of the canyon to the base of the tallest trestle, where a squat mass of masonry footed the highest leg into bedrock, and set into that masonry, exactly as she remembered it from childhood, was a small iron-banded plank door, and it was shut, and even at that distance she knew, without going near, that it was locked. Because it had been locked every day of her life, and her father had never once told her what was inside. That door is where this whole story is going. Hold it in your mind, because she will not open it tonight, and she will not open it for a good while yet, and that waiting is the point. She only looked at it across the dark, and something in her chest turned over. And she said aloud to the empty shack, in the flat, exhausted voice of a person deciding to live, "All right. 1 bent. I will fix 1 bent, and then we will see." And she blew out the lamp. She woke to canyon light coming red through the sprung wall, and she did the thing that would fill the middle of her days for the whole hard summer. She went to work. If you have ever loved the sight of a broken thing coming right under patient hands, this is the season of the story you will want to slow down and live in. She started at the nearest leaning bent, the one whose foot had rotted where a seep kept it wet, and she learned by failing at it that a woman alone cannot simply replace a 90-foot leg. So, she did not. She learned instead her father's grade books teaching her, page by page, in his cramped, even hand, that a flume is not a thing you rebuild all at once, but a thing you nurse back 1 joint at a time. She cut a scab timber from the sound heart of a fallen bent and sistered it to the leaning leg and drove it home with an iron maul she found under the bench, and the leg stood straighter. And she stood there breathing hard, with her hands bleeding, and understood that it could be done. Slowly, alone, but done. She caulked. That was the labor that ate the most days and taught her the most peace. Where the V-boards had merely dried and sprung rather than fallen, she drove oakum into the seams with a mallet and a caulking iron, as her father's book showed her, working the tarred fiber deep until the joint would hold water again, and she went along the sound runs of the trough on her hands and knees. Seam by seam, mile fraction by mile fraction, her palms first blistering and then hardening into something that no longer belonged to a banker's idea of a kitchen girl. She learned the trough's own language, which boards had gone punky under a sound face and which would hold, which seams wept and which merely sweated, and she found she could read a 50-foot run now with her eyes half shut. The trough telling her things she had not known she was being taught. She reashingled the headwork shack with shakes, she split herself off a downed cedar, and the draw-knife, her father's draw-knife, the one thing the bank had let her keep because it was worth less than the paper it would have taken to seize it, turned out to be the finest tool she owned. And every draw of it down a length of cedar felt like a hand held. She glazed the one small window with a pane she carried up wrapped in her spare linen, and bedded in putty she mixed from linseed and whiting, bought on a credit she had no right to expect, and got anyway, from people we will come to. She fell into a rhythm those weeks that she would remember afterward as the closest to happiness she had come since the burying. She rose before light and ate cold bread standing in the shack door and watched the sun come up the far wall, and then she worked until her arms gave out and slept the black dreamless sleep of the used-up body, and rose and did it again. She kept a running list in the front of one grade book of what was sound and what was not, checking off the miles as she made them whole, and the small daily ledger of it, a bent scabbed here, 100 feet of seam driven there, was its own quiet reward, the kind of progress a person can hold in their hands. She learned the country, too, in that slow-walking way, which she had not truly known as a child healing her father, where the deer came down to the seeps at dusk, which ledge held the morning shade, how the red rock went the color of banked coals in the last light, and cooled to rose and then to gray. She learned that a person alone is not the same as a person lonely. She had been lonely in the crowded washroom over Bridget's kitchen, surrounded by kind women who had already buried her. Up here, with the trough and the draw-knife in her father's hand guiding hers across every page, she was less alone than she had been in a year. The forge work taught her patience of another order. She had never worked iron, and the first strap she drew came out cold shut and brittle and snapped under the maul. And she wasted 3 days and a good measure of Cormac's charity before she understood she had been rushing the heat. So she slowed. She let the iron come to the right yellow and no faster, and she struck it while it was ready and set it down when it was not, and there is a lesson in that if Flume will teach you, if nothing else does, that a thing forced before its time breaks, and a thing given its time holds. By the end she was hanging strap hinges that rang true and would outlast her, and she took a plain animal pride in them that no banker's pity could reach. And here is the first rung of the thing that kept her climbing, the first small answer that opened a larger question. When she went at last to the headworks itself, the great timber gate, at the very top, where the Flume met the mountain, she expected to find a dry mouth, a dead intake, because the Flume had carried no water in 3 long human lifetimes. And she had assumed the source had failed with it. It had not. Above the headgate, where the canyon pinched to a cleft, a living spring came out of the red rock, cold and clear and steady, and it had been coming out all along, all those dead years, spilling uselessly down the talus because the gate that should have caught it hung rotted open. She stood with her hand in that water and felt the cold of it climb her wrist, and a question set its hook in her that she could not shake loose. If the source still ran and the trough still stood along most of its length, then what exactly had died here? A flume with no timber to carry was called dead. But the water was not dead. The water was right there, waiting, as it had waited 60 years, and she found she did not yet have the words for what that meant. She rehung the headgate. It took her the better part of a week, forging new strap iron cold and hot at a little field forge she rigged from the shack stove, and when at last she dropped the mended gate and it seated and held. A thin sheet of the spring backed up behind it clear as glass, and she opened it a crack, and for the first time in 60 years a shallow bright skin of water slid down into the mouth of her father's flume and ran, chuckling, along the caulked run she had made sound, and stopped where the rot began, and pooled there and soaked away. It ran perhaps 200 feet. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She sat down on the trestle deck with her feet hanging over 90 feet of nothing, and she laughed, and then she cried, and she could not have told you which was which. But before we go on, because the next thing she found is what turns this from a story about a broken flume into a story about what her father hid inside it, do one small thing for me. If a broken, written off, laughed at thing has ever quietly become the most important thing in someone's life, take a moment now to subscribe and stay close, because the widow is about to open a book she was never meant to understand. That book was in the shack. She had dusted the grade books off and used them as manuals all summer without ever really reading them, as you use a hammer without studying it. But on a rainy evening late in the season, penned in and idle, she took the last and thickest of them down and read it properly by lamplight. And she could not make the columns come out right. A Flume's grade book is a plain thing. It records the fall of the trough, so many inches of drop per 100 feet, enough to keep the load moving, and not so much it runs away. Her father's early books were exactly that. But this last book, dated the winter before he died, was full of a second set of grades penciled beside the first. Gentler figures, a much flatter fall, and long tables of something labeled only Q at points named for landmarks she knew: the Narrows, Antelope Bend, the mill sluice, and then, past the mill, a whole column of places that had nothing to do with timber at all. The dry sections of the valley floor, the parched Halloran Flats, the Kestrel Town well, and beside each a figure in that same steady hand for how much would arrive there, and how fast. And though she lacked the schooling to read it fully, but she had enough of her father in her blood to feel the shape of it, and that shape was impossible, and it made her go cold all over on a warm night. These were not grades for floating logs. Logs do not care about arriving at a town well. She sat with the book open and the rain on the new shingles, and she thought, in words at last, he was not fixing it to carry timber. And then she thought the thing she was not ready for. He was fixing it to carry something else. And she looked across the dark canyon toward the iron door in the trestle footing, and she already knew this was not the end of it. She wanted to open the door that night. Of course she did. But the door had no key she could find, and a hasp of iron her maul only rang against, and some caution older than her curiosity told her that a thing her father had guarded her whole life was not a thing to break into by lamplight in a storm. So she banked the lamp, and she waited. And I am going to make you wait too. because that is how she lived it, and because the waiting is where the meaning grows. Set the door aside once more. 3 times now the canyon has shown it to her, and 3 times she has turned away. And each time she has told herself the same private thing, that she already knew this wasn't the end. And each time the knowing got heavier. There was another rung before the door, and it belongs here, because it is the one that made the survey real to her hands instead of only to her fears. Cleaning out the shack's workbench for the second time, she found that one of the drawers had a false back not cleverly hidden, just a plain second panel her father had fitted and never mentioned, and behind it a flat tin. And in the tin, a bundle of field notes and a single sheet of heavy paper folded small. The notes were shot lines, run at dawn by the look of the light angles he had penciled beside them, along ground that had nothing to do with the trough at all. The dry wash below the mill, the Halloran Flats, a bench above the town well. He had been out surveying the valley floor in secret, at first light, when no one would see a man with a level walking parched ground that grew nothing. And the folded sheet was a rough map of ditches, the same web she would later see drawn clean on the plat, penciled here in a hurried hand with a date and 3 underlined words, "It will run." She sat back on her heels, holding it. It will run. He had not been dreaming. He had been proving. And a man does not survey by stealth at dawn and hide his findings behind a false panel unless he is afraid of someone. She put the tin back where it had lain all those decades, and that night no sleep came to her at all. And she understood that the padlocked door across the canyon was not the beginning of the secret, but the end of it, the last locked chamber of a work her father had been assembling in silence and in fear. Stay with me here, because this is where it stops being a story about mending a flume and becomes a story about who was willing to let it be mended at all. Take a moment, if the widow's work has held you this far, to subscribe, and we will go on, because she was not, it turned out, going to be let to work in peace, and here the second half of the story sharpens its edge. She had needed supplies she could not forge or split nails, oil, glass, flour, and she had gotten them the only way a woman with no money gets anything, on the strength of who would vouch for her, and 3 people in the valley had chosen to vouch. There was Bridget Halloran, who ran the bakery and the boarding kitchen in Kestrel. A wide, slow woman with flour to the elbows who had known Elias and who fed Prudence on the days she came down for goods and never once put it on a bill. There was Amos Fielding, the town carpenter, gray and spare and short of speech, who had raised trestle bents alongside her father as a young man and who began, without ever being asked, to send a wagon up the grade every second week with sawn lumber and a note that said only, "From the old stock, no charge, tell no one." And there was Cormac Doyle, the blacksmith, black-bearded and enormous and loud, who had heard about the strap iron she was forging cold and had come up the road himself one day to watch her at it, and had laughed not cruelly. The first laugh in the whole story that was not cruel, and said, "Girl, you will ruin your father's anvil doing it thus," and had then, over the next weeks, taught her to do it right, and retired the mended headgate strap in his own shop, and would take no coin. They helped her, these 3, and they did it as frontier people do, with work and goods and a stubborn averted-eyes decency, not with speeches. Bridget would send a loaf up in the wagon and a jar of preserves and a note about her joints. Cormac would arrive of a Sunday, ostensibly to fish the spring, and leave having rehung a bent. Amos said almost nothing at all, and did the most, and it was Amos, leaning on his wagon one gray morning with his hat turning slow in his hands, who brought her the news that turned the summer dark. "Croft has put a date on it," he said. He would not look at her while he said it. "The syndicate that took the high timber, they want the trestles down. Sound heart timber, 90-foot legs, and they mean to pull it and haul it off for mine shoring." Croft signed the salvage order at the bank. They start at the tall bent, 3 weeks Tuesday. He turned his hat around once. "I thought you ought to hear it from a friend and not a stranger with a saw." Prudence stood very still. "They cannot. It is mine. I bought it. You bought the lot." Amos said it gently, because he had already thought it through and knew the shape of the trap. "But there is an old salvage lien on the trestle timber from the company days, and the syndicate bought that lien off the receiver, and Croft will argue a lien beats a widow's tax deed every time it comes before a judge that banks with him. They do not want your Kenyon, Prue, they want the sticks it stands on. And once the trestles are down, he did not finish it, but she finished it in her own chest. Once the trestles were down, there was no Flume, and no water would ever run 50 miles to anyone, and whatever her father had spent his last winter proving would go for mined timber into a hole in the ground and be forgotten. And she understood, standing there, why the door had been locked her whole life. She understood that a man who had discovered that a dead Flume could be made to carry water to a valley that had none water, that would make dry, worthless ground into the richest ground in the territory, was a man sitting on the most dangerous knowledge in the county. Because the men who wanted the valley cheap wanted it dry. Dry country is grazing you can buy for pennies. A watered valley is farms and towns and 100 men who will never sell. Her father had learned how to bring water to the valley, and he had told no one, and he had put the proof of it behind an iron door, and he had died before he could bring it into the light. And now the same men who had wanted it buried were about to pull down the very bones that could carry it. 3 weeks Tuesday, she said. 3 weeks Tuesday, said Amos. I am sorry, Prue. She did not sleep much after that. She lay on the mended cot and listened to the wind work the trestle, and she counted the days against the 50 miles of trough, and she understood there was no honest arithmetic in which one woman finished 50 miles of Flume in 3 weeks. And on the second sleepless night, with the salvage date hanging over her like the shadow of the tall bent itself, she rose in the dark and took the lamp and Cormac's biggest cold chisel and Amos's pry bar, and she went across the trestle to the iron door in the footing, because there was no more time to wait, and the waiting had done its work anyway. She was ready now. It took her half the night. The hasp she finally sheared, the door iron-banded plank swollen in its frame. She wept and swore and levered until it groaned open on the black chamber behind it, a dry stone room the size of a pantry, cut into the footing itself, that her father had built into the Flume's own foundation, where no salvage crew would ever think to look. Here is the object at last. On a shelf of dressed stone sat a strong box, and when she pried it she found, first, gold, coin gold, a heavy canvas sack of it, double eagles and half eagles gone dull with the years' wages. She understood the pay the folded company had owed him and somehow made good in metal before it died, or the savings of a frugal man who trusted rock over banks. Either way, more money than she had held in her life, enough to keep her fed for years. And a hard frontier life would have told most people that the gold was the treasure, and to take it and go. But it was not the treasure, and she knew it the moment her hand touched what lay beneath the sack, because the gold it would turn out, was only the key. Under the gold was oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth was her father's last survey, the full, clean-drawn plat of the water grades. Not the working figures of the book, but the finished proof, every station shot and checked. The flat, gentle fall from the living spring at the headworks, the whole length of the trough to the valley floor, with the arriving flow figured at every dry section. The Halloran Flats, the town well, the entire parched sweep of Kestrel Valley shone greening under a spider's web of ditches that ran, all of them, from the mouth of her father's flume. He had done it. On paper, he had already done it. The dead flume that carried timber could carry water gravity, fed the entire distance, and the water was already there. Running from the spring she had unstoppered with her own hands, and the proof of every foot of it lay finished and signed in her palm. And folded inside the plat, sealed, her name on the outside in the steady hand she had been reading all summer, was a letter. She sat down on the cold stone floor with the lamp beside her, and she opened it, and she read it aloud to the empty room in a voice that would not stay level, because some things you have to say out loud to believe. To my Prue, who I hope is the one reading this, it began. If you have this in your hands, then I am gone before I could finish, and the door is open at last. And I am sorry for every night you asked me what was behind it, and I could not tell you. I could not tell you because a child cannot keep a thing this heavy, and this is the heaviest thing I ever carried. The flume is not a flume, or it will not be when it is done. I have run the grades 100 times, and I am not wrong. The water from the high spring will run this trough the whole 50 miles down to the flats, and it will make that dead ground the best in the territory, and any man who owns the crossing owns the water. And any valley that has water is a valley that cannot be bought cheap and thrown away. That is why I never told the company, and never told the bank, and never told a living soul. For there are men who would burn this proof, and me with it, to keep this valley dry and cheap, and God forgive me, I was afraid. And being afraid, I was slow, and being slow, I have run out of time. But I did not run out of you. You walked this line at my heel from the time you could walk at all, and you know the fall of this canyon better than any surveyor I could hire. And you were never once afraid of the height or the dark or the men. I lit the lantern every night so the water could find its way home, and you thought it a foolish thing an old man said, but it was a promise, Prue. The water is coming down to this valley, and you are the one who brings it. I am not leaving you gold. Any fool can be left gold. I am leaving you the crossing, and the water, and the finishing of the one true thing I ever made. Keep the flume. Keep the light. Bring the water down. You were always the one I meant to give it to. Your father. She sat in the stone room with the letter in her lap and the lamp burning low, and what she felt in that moment was not triumph, nor riches, nor vindication. She felt chosen, which is a larger and quieter thing. She folded the letter and put it in her satchel beside the draw-knife, and she took the gold and the survey too, and she went back across the trestle in the last of the dark, and by the time the canyon light came red through the sprung wall, she was no longer a widow squatting in a ruin. She was the keeper of the crossing, and she had 3 weeks before men with saws came to take it from her, and she had, at last, a plan. She did not run at Croft with the letter and the plat, waving them and shouting, because a letter from a dead man and a survey no judge could read are not, by themselves, worth much against a lien and a banker. She had learned patience from a flume. So instead, She did the thing her father's whole life had been building toward, and she did it with the three friends who had chosen her. And it went thus. She took Cormac Doyle and Amos Fielding up to the headworks and showed them the spring and the mended gate and the survey, and she watched two hard-headed frontier men go quiet as she had gone quiet, and then she said, "I do not need you to believe me. I need you to help me make the trough hold water down as far as the Halloran Flats before 3 weeks Tuesday, not 50 miles. Just far enough that a valley can see it with its own eyes." Because she had understood the one thing the flatterers and schemers never understand: proof a man cannot see does not move a man. She would not argue that the flume could carry water. She would run water out of it, in daylight, into a dry field, in front of the whole valley. They worked as they had never worked. Amos brought every sound board from the old stock, and two nephews who asked no questions. Cormac forged strap and pin by the barrel. Bridget Halloran fed the whole crew out of her boarding kitchen and told half of Kestrel, in the manner a baker tells a town, that something was coming to the Halloran Flats and they had best come see. Prudence caulked until her hands would not close, and rehung 3 bents and patched the launder over the worst gulf, and drove her crew and herself down the canyon length, one caulked seam at a time. And this is the competence made public, the long private summer of one woman's labor now multiplied by many hands and pointed at a single day. There were nights the crew slept in a row on the shack floor, too tired to eat, and mornings Cormac's hammer started before the light, and an afternoon a bent nearly went and took Amos's youngest nephew with it, and they caught it, all of them at the ropes together, and stood shaking afterward, and then went back up. That was how the miles came sound, board by board, hand over hand. Against the calendar. They divided the work as her father would have. Amos took the trestle, because he had raised it as a young man and his old hands remembered the joinery in a way no book could teach. He moved along the leaning bents like a man greeting relatives, and where a footing had rotted, he showed the nephews how to shore and sister and pack a new sill without ever pulling the leg. And the trestle came upright under him. Cormac took the iron, every strap, pin, brace, and gate fitting the miles wanted, forged in a portable rig they hauled up on the wagon, his great arms swinging in the red dust from dawn to dusk while he sang low, tuneless songs that carried down the canyon. Bridget took the valley. That was her genius, and it was no smaller than the others. She went from porch to porch in Kestrel and let it be known, in the offhand way of a woman who has heard a thing and cannot help repeating it, that the Widow Vane was going to run water out of the dead flume onto the Halloran Flats on the 3rd Tuesday, and folk could come laugh if they liked, but they had best come. And Prudence took the trough itself, the caulking, the seam-by-seam labor no one else had the patience for, on her knees the length of the sound runs with the oakum and the iron, mending the wound down the canyon one joint at a time. 4 people, 50 miles of dead flume, 3 weeks. It should not have been possible, and it very nearly was not. And there is a particular kind of story the frontier told over and over, because it was the only kind that kept people alive out there, the story of a thing done that could not be done, by people who had no business succeeding and refused to stop. And the syndicate felt it coming. Croft rode up to the headworks himself, once, on a good horse, and sat looking at the water backed clear behind the headgate and the crew swarming the trestle, and his level banker's voice was not quite so level when he called across to her. "You are wasting these men's labor, Mrs. Vane," he said. The salvage order stands. Whatever you are building, it comes down Tuesday. Prudence stood on the trestle deck with the draw knife in her hand where she had been dressing a board, and she looked down at him without any heat at all. "Then you had best come Tuesday," she said, "and bring the valley. I want them to see what you mean to pull down." He did not like that. She saw it cross his face, the first crack in the level. A man like Croft can pull down a thing no one values while the valley sleeps, and no one minds. He cannot so easily pull down a thing a whole valley has come to watch. But the lean was the lean, and he had a judge, and he rode back down sure enough of his ground, and Prudence went back to her boards, and the water climbed one calked mile closer to the flats. On the morning of the third Tuesday, half of Kestrel Valley came up the canyon road. They came because Bridget had told them, and because a town that has never seen anything wants to see something. And they came half expecting to laugh, since the story on every porch was the same, that the widow Vane had spent a dead man's gold rebuilding a wooden snake with no head. Croft came with 2 men from the syndicate in eastern coats and a paper in his breast pocket, and they all gathered on the dry Halloran Flats at the foot of the canyon, the poorest, thirstiest ground in the valley, cracked hardpan that had never grown anything a cow would eat, and they looked up the red wall at the Flume standing new, braced in the morning light, and at the small figure of a woman in a faded flowered dress standing at the far end of the mended launder where it opened over a field that had been dead since before she was born. Prudence did not make a speech. The old stories do not lie about this. Either the strongest thing you can do is let the evidence speak and stand out of its road. She lifted her hand to Amos at the head gate a half-mile up, and Amos through the gate, and for a long moment nothing happened at all, and she heard, down among the watching valley, the first low chuckle of men who had come to be proven right about a foolish woman. And then the Flume began to sing. It came down the canyon as she had known it her whole childhood, that far, steady rush growing, a shallow run of clear spring water sliding down ruled feet of fall per mile, chuckling over the caulked seams, gaining and gaining. And it came around Antelope Bend in a bright ribbon and down the last long run, and it poured out of the Laundermouth over the dead Halloran Flats in a clean silver sheet that fanned across the cracked hardpan and sank and spread and shone. Water, running water, gravity-fed, 50 miles from a spring no one had known still ran, spilling free onto the worst ground in the valley in front of every soul who had come to laugh. Nobody laughed. There was, instead, a sound she would remember the rest of her life, the sound of several hundred thirsty people making no sound at all, and then a single old rancher near the front took off his hat, and then they were all of them shouting, and children ran into the spreading water, and Bridget Halloran was weeping into her flower-white apron, and the dead Flume was not dead, and had never truly been dead. It had only been waiting all those long decades for the one person her father had chosen to bring the water home. It was into that noise that Prudence turned at last to Silas Croft, and she did not gloat, because the letter in her satchel had told her what she was, and it was not a person who gloats. She simply held out the survey plat, the finished proof, and beside it the recorded water right claim that Amos's lawyer cousin in the county seat had entered against the spring in her name the week before, quiet and legal and first, while Croft had been watching the trestles. "You may tear down the timber, Mr. Croft," she said, loud enough for the eastern coats to hear. "The lien is on the sticks, but the water right is filed, and it is mine, and it is first, and it runs whether the trough is wood or ditch. You cannot salvage water. Any man who wants to farm this valley or water a herd or fill a town well will buy his share from the crossing. She let that settle. Including your bank, Mr. Croft, when your town lots go dry and your grazing land is worth 10 times as much wet, I will sell you your share at the same fair price as any other man. That is more than you offered me across your desk, but you will buy it from me. The Eastern coats were already talking low and fast among themselves, and she saw the thing happen that the old stories promise, the antagonist undone not by her force but by his own arithmetic. A syndicate that had bought a valley to keep it dry and cheap had just watched it become wet and dear, and there was no profit now in pulling down the very structure that carried the water that it made. Their cheap land expensive. Within the hour, before witnesses, they let the salvage order die. It was worth more to them, suddenly, to leave the flume standing. Croft rode down the canyon a smaller man than he had ridden up, and he did, in the fullness of that year, buy his water share from the widow Vane at a fair price, because a banker, before all things, can read a figure. And the figure said the valley she had watered was worth more than his pride. But that is not where the story ends, because the gold and the vindication and the beaten banker were never the treasure. The treasure was the thing the letter named, and she claimed it that evening, alone, after the valley had gone home wet and singing. She climbed the path to the headworks in the last red light, as she had watched her father climb every night of her girlhood, and she found the squat brass lantern still on its shelf, where it had sat 60 years, and she cleaned the soot from its chimney and filled it from the oil tin and struck a light and set it in the window frame at the head of the flume, above the running water, so that its small, warm eye looked out over the whole dark descending length of the crossing toward the valley, now glinting with the first thin threads of water finding the fields. And she understood it now, the foolish, gentle thing her father had said, the sentence she had carried unopened her whole life as she had carried the letter unopened up the trestle. He had lit the lantern so that water some day would come down to a thirsty valley and know where home was. He had not been talking to a child. He had been making a promise across 60 years to a valley that did not yet know it was thirsty, and to a spring that ran uselessly in the dark, and to a daughter who walked the survey line at his heel and did not yet know she was being taught to keep a crossing. The gold had bought her time, and the survey had beaten the bank, but this the lantern lit, the water running, the fields greening below, the being the one he chose out of all the world to finish the one true thing he ever made. This was what he had left her, and it had never been for sale, and it had always, from the day she was born, been hers. She stayed. She did not take the gold and go build a comfortable life in a town, which she could easily have done. She stayed and became what her father had been and what he had raised her without her knowing to become, the keeper of the flume and the water, and she kept the trough sound and the gate true and the water right fair. And the dry valley that had laughed at her greened around her year on year, farms where there had been hardpan, an orchard on the old Halloran Flats, a town at the valley mouth that grew because it had water when the country around it did not. She hired Amos's nephews on and taught them the fall of the canyon as she had been taught it, and she kept a book of her own beside her father's, and in the front of it she wrote his name and under it her own. Bridget's bakery grew into the biggest in 3 counties on the trade the water brought, and she never once let Prudence pay for a loaf. Cormac Doyle's forge could not keep up with the plows and the ditch iron a watered valley wanted, and he took on 2 apprentices and complained happily about it for the rest of his life. Amos Fielding grew old on the trestle he had raised twice, and when at the very last he could no longer make the climb, Prudence brought a chair up the path so he could sit up at the headworks shelf in the sun and watch the water go down, and they did not need to say much. 2 people who have built a thing together seldom do. The valley named the crossing for her father in the end, though it was her who kept it, and she let the name stand and never argued it, because she thought he would have liked his name on the water more than on any house the bank could take. And the ones who had laughed on the auction porch grew quiet about it over the years, in the manner of people who have been proven small. And some of them came, one at a time, to buy a share of the water, and stayed to say a stiff word of thanks, and she gave them the water and the word both evenly, and kept no account of who had laughed. And every single night, as he had, she climbed to the headworks in the last of the light, and lit the small brass lantern in the window above the running water and the valley below her. If they looked up, could see that one warm point of light burning at the head of the crossing, and the older ones came to know what it meant, and the children grew up to the far, steady rush of moving water and the sight of that light, and never thought either of them strange. Maybe that is the part most of us miss, watching from wherever you are tonight. We spend so much of our worry on the gold on the settlement pushed across the desk, on the $4, on being told by some level voice what our worth amounts to after the notes are paid. And the whole while the real inheritance is the quieter thing, the promise somebody made and did not live to keep, and the trust that we are the one they meant to finish it. Prudence Vane was handed nothing the county thought was worth a coin, and she turned it into water for a valley and a life with her hands in honest work in a place that was hers, and the man who called her father a poor businessman and her Flume a monument to bad planning ended by buying his water at her ditch. She never gloated over him. She only lit the lantern each dusk so the running water would always know the road down to the fields. If there is a light somebody once asked you to keep, and you have not yet understood why keep it anyway, light it tonight. You may be the one they chose to finish the true thing, and you may not know it for a long while yet. If this story reached something in you, tell me down in the comments about the promise somebody left in your keeping and where in the world you are watching from. And take a moment to like and subscribe so the next story can find its road to you. Thank you for sitting with me, and with the widow, and with the water that came home.